Welcome to Grid Talk and happy Pride Month. My name is Ruby Price, and today we're here to review the 2025 Spanish Grand Prix and potentially the final race for the Circuit de Catalunya. Joining me today, we've got Owain Medford
Hello.
and Dev Tyagi.
Hi, good to be back.
Good to have you. So, despite a late safety car, McLaren managed to flex their cars to another 1-2, with Oscar Piastri finishing ahead of his teammate Lando Norris, and a surprise podium appearance for Charles Leclerc. But the discussions going into the weekend were all about flexi wings, though the discussions coming out of the race, they've all been about a 10-second penalty given for what looked like an intentional collision between Max Verstappen and George Russell. Max had been told to give Russell the position to Russell by his team, but to his own reluctance. And as George was going past, you see Max speed back up and hit the side of the Mercedes. Owain, how do you feel? Was the right penalty applied?
Yeah, for me, 100%. It very clearly looked to me like Max was trying to give the position back in such a way that he could then immediately retake it, by making it, very difficult. Doing it into turn five where, you kind of want to hug the inside and then drift outwards, whereas he parked his car on the inside and obviously let Russell through on the outside, trying to give him the outside line. So he's obviously going to have to go further and slower, while still, having the position, but in such a way that Max is still in an advantageous position going into turns six and seven. Um, Now, I think that obviously he didn't execute that particularly well at all, and just completely crashed into the side of Russell. And you can't do that. It's um, obviously it's not within the rules, but also it's just not good sportsmanship, really. Like it was a slightly I would say cynical way of giving back the position, which we know isn't allowed. And I think at the end of the day, he got the penalty he deserved for it, because you can't be doing things like that and expecting not to be penalised for what was pretty egregiously a breach of the rules.
Yeah, Dev, we had Nico Rosberg on the Sky Sports commentary feed calling for a black flag for Max Verstappen. Obviously, it's an intentional, well, seemingly intentional collision, and Max Verstappen hasn't denied that. Um, we saw in 2017, Sebastian Vettel got a 10-second stop and go penalty and also some community service after the race for deliberately hitting Lewis Hamilton during, a race scenario. This incident started with Max's, admittedly great save on that safety car restart. Fair play to him and full marks for that, but was obviously then compromised to Charles Leclerc and George Russell, both of whom bumped into the Red Bull. How do you feel by comparison to Owain?
So I really support, or rather, I should say, I second Nico Rosberg there. I was hearing the commentary completely. On the one hand, Max Verstappen is an ebullient, confident, and maverick driver who really knows how to raise the wheels of even a mediocre car this season, which hasn't really had amazing race pace in consecutive Grand Prix. But today's incident is a glaring reminder that Max Verstappen is basically a capricious talent also. And sometimes he really does not understand that racing has to be maintained within the confines of normality and legality. That move on George Russell, which was, I think, pulled off rather deliberately, could have hampered George Russell's race completely, which have been a disaster, which would have been a disaster because Mercedes did not have a great outing any which ways with Kimi Antonelli. Sorry, in my mind, I was about to say Raikkonen, but Max Verstappen ought to have watched out there. And first of all, whining at a time where just 1.5 laps are remaining over the team radio to your team, which has clearly communicated in the very first instance that kindly give the position back to the other competing driver, makes no sense. Of course, we all know that Max Verstappen is a great race winner, but at the same time, he's also a sore loser. And he proved that point. I dread using these harsh words for an exceptionally talented and gifted driver. But we've seen some dramatic incidents in the past on this very first on this very circuit. 2016, of course, Nico Rosberg versus Lewis Hamilton, and later on Niki Lauda making Hamilton understand, like an elderly figure, like an avuncular presence that he's always been, that Lewis, listen, you're in the wrong here, and then Hamilton understanding. But nobody actually deliberately uh, collided with the other person there. So Max Verstappen definitely deserved a black flag. And first of all, his reading of the incident at the beginning was completely wrong too, Ruby, because he said that, Charles hit me deliberately. No, that's not true. Charles never hit him. The replays were there without anyone wasting too much of a time. And it was found out that there was a bit of a racing contact between George, who made probably the slightest of nudges around the front part of the Red Bull, but it was kind of a racing incident. But then Max, ever a whiner on this occasion, ought to have watched out, and that move could have been disastrous for himself also. And look what it has done. There are memes already floating over social media saying that driver of the day started P3, ends P10. But I'm happy because at the end of the day, Fernando Alonso gets to score his points, and I'm not complaining.
So, lining up first and second, McLaren were the favourites after a dominant display in qualifying on Saturday. They ran a different strategy to Verstappen, who was chasing, but really, Owain, was there ever a chance that they weren't going to finish where they have done?
I don't personally think so. I think that Spain is such a sort of it's a chassis orientated track, and it seems that McLaren have completely ironed out at least not getting taken by surprise on undercuts and things like that, and they just seem to have be able to build the right kind of gap where you earn yourself that one lap of breathing space. To the point where it didn't really matter. It didn't even matter that when Verstappen made that third stop, potentially trying to pull a sort of Spain 2021, I think, or Hungary 2019 that Mercedes did with the second stop to to force Verstappen himself into a corner in that time. It didn't really work on McLaren whatsoever because they did seem to have the best tyre wear, as we thought they would going in, and the track is one that suits them. It's medium and high speed corners at this point, almost all of it. The slowest speed corner on the track is probably, maybe turn 10 or quite possibly, turn 11. We don't have the sort of chicanes that that were in the track before. And as such, it's just kind of played into the direct strengths of the McLaren and means that they do just have, that small advantage that means that they can pull up gaps when they need to and, run the race from the front. It wasn't, I guess, sort of even a question, even at the safety car restart, whether it was going to be an issue for them. I mean, obviously Norris was taken advantage of on the start, but from that point onwards, he managed to get himself back into second place, and at that point, that was it. There's nothing that anyone could really do, and they sort of raced away at the front. I mean, the only thing for Norris is that he sort of secured into that second spot just by the overtake at the start that put him, held him up for a bit and put him so far back. And right now, it seems that Piastri and Norris are equally matched enough that there was no way that he could have made back the difference both on tyre wear and just in the time gap itself.
Yeah, we did see Lando start to close in on Oscar Piastri over the course of a couple of laps, but then once they'd kind of got through a bit of traffic and it was approaching more the point where Norris was going to be stopping, we saw Oscar pull that gap back out, and I think it just kind of showed that he was in a position to be able to save a bit more of his tyres and then just put in a couple of laps when he needed to just go, nah, mate, you can stay behind for a couple more laps. But Dev, these flexi wing changes I mentioned earlier, they were brought in this weekend, but they don't really seem to have nerfed McLaren as a couple of teams might have been expecting. Have the FIA misunderstood the cause of their performance, or is it just that McLaren were that good?
I think that the FIA, truth be told, have taken Red Bull's intimations about their concerns about McLaren's wings being illegal a bit too seriously, because it was Red Bull, first of all, who had posed their doubts about McLaren's wings legality, whether it is front or rear. But we have to understand that what was tried, what was the attempt that was made. We have to understand that. So everybody wanted to create a level playing field. And for that, the regulative directed that the wings should now pass a deflection test, which measures the leeway of their flex. And this was reduced from 15 mm to around 10 mm, if I'm right. But whether it is 10 mm or whether it is 9.5 mm, I think McLaren have produced um, daring, and a world championship winning car, and that is clear. And today was an excellent exhibition of their cornering speed as well as the massive straight line speed with which they have thwarted the plans of their closest rival so far, which is the Red Bull, in particularly the Red Bull of Max Verstappen. So it's kind of a tight hit back to their critics. And what a better way to win this race to be than to actually capture a one and two. And unless I'm very much mistaken, when Oscar Piastri and Norris locked out the front row, it was the best possible result at this particular venue at Catalonia, home to the Spanish Grand Prix for McLaren since 1998. So this was an excellent result, and there was absolute consistency which was maintained after the qualifying by delivering a comprehensive team result for McLaren. And once again, a very, very legendary, iconic British constructor is back to the top. And understandably so, the powers that be who've been dominating the roost, who've been ruling the roost, seem to be concerned. Probably the ice is thinning beyond their feet, and they have only themselves to blame. But Piastri and Norris couldn't be happier.
Yeah, definitely a statement victory, I think you could, or even a statement weekend in general, 1-2, as you say, the first 1-2 in qualifying that they've had at this circuit since 1998 as well. It just feels like McLaren have got that zing back amongst them that we've not seen like as a sort of like drivers' championship since 2008 or so, but as a constructor themselves, like obviously they won last season, but continuing that momentum through, you can have one season where you win, but to do it consistently, like, yeah, it just feels good to see this team prospering and doing well. And when it comes to implementing technical regulations to try and pin back the competition, I feel like if the teams are behaving legally, it's not on the FIA to hold them back and make a level playing field. This sport is a meritocracy, and if you're at the front, we were saying it about Red Bull for the 3 seasons they were out front. You know, if you're out front and you deserve to be there, you have every right to be there. You shouldn't be held back. But yeah, so the hot temperatures were really holding back Ferrari, speaking of holding teams back, in the middle of the race. And even with a fresh set of mediums for Charles Leclerc, they weren't really in the podium picture until that late safety car. The podium for Charles was a much better result than Hamilton's P6, who just couldn't get the grip seemingly. Owain, was it just the temperatures that can account for the mixed fortunes at Ferrari?
Um, I think so in some ways. Obviously that hampered their sort of performance across the board, but for some reason, it did seem that I think maybe Hamilton's setup was, or the way he was driving, just meant that he seemed to have higher tire wear and just couldn't really keep with the field. We saw that early on, um, off of the start. Taking that, managing sort of really well to well, even off a poor start to maintain his position and manage to kind of have everything open up for him, and Hamilton, managed to take fourth place. But it was very clear after even 9 laps, and it shouldn't have taken that long, to be honest with you, that Hamilton was clearly didn't have the pace to be able to attack in front, and I think a couple of laps earlier could have done Leclerc's race even better. Hamilton, on the other hand, just seemed to sort of be going backwards essentially. Didn't seem to have the sort of balance in the car that he needed, and it persisted across the entire race. I mean, and that's what ultimately has helped promote Hulkenberg up to the position that he's been in. Is that it wasn't just good management by Hulkenberg there, but it was also the poor performance of the Ferrari, and they really do need to look into this because Hamilton seems to be in sort of a maybe slightly better position from where he started, and in cleaner air, and obviously something is not working to the point where even with a decent strategy call, he ran basically a very similar strategy to Leclerc, but just couldn't maintain the speed. And we saw him eaten up by what was very clearly a very fast Sauber. But the fact remains that a car that is finishing on the podium, kind of on pace, and through good strategy calls, shouldn't, the sister car shouldn't be sitting there being overtaken by a Sauber. That's just not the order of things and of the of the cars. So something's clearly going on. And we've seen it a lot, really. I think it seems more that Leclerc understands how to drive the car better, and seems to have more experience in the way that the Ferrari drives than Hamilton for all his talent. Because we've seen this multiple times across the season, and we've seen it again. Is that Hamilton does just seem to be that one step behind, being able to extract pace from the car and manage the tyres, as well as he needs to, particularly on a track like this. And ultimately, I think it's what caused his sort of gentle slide down the field, that we got today.
Yeah, finishing one position behind where he started when you've considered that, Max Verstappen's had a penalty, so, should arguably be, much further, ahead, really. Like Lewis Hamilton finishing behind where he started in a Ferrari is not what he's signed up for. And I've seen people calling for, maybe Ferrari to change the driver situation. I think that is ridiculous. I think they need to remember Lewis Hamilton has won a race this season, a sprint race, granted. He did ultimately then get disqualified from the Grand Prix later on, but he still won something. So he's shown that on his day he still got that capability and that performance, but it's just not showing right now. But something that is showing right now is our 5-star podcast quality, as far as I'm concerned, at the very least. And if you would enjoy this podcast, we'd love it if you could take 5 to leave us a 5-star rating on Spotify or a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. And if you're listening and aren't currently subscribed to the channel, please consider helping us out with a like and a subscribe. And don't forget, you can support us on Patreon for further content, including an exclusive podcast. So, Dev, Owain touched on this slightly. Nico Hulkenberg absolutely benefited from a safety car, but he'll be very much celebrating that. P5 in the end, but was driving a very strong race even before the safety car and brought it home for his first points since China and Sauber's best result since Baku 2022. How impressed were you with Nico Hulkenberg this weekend?
No, I think more surprised than impressed, and of course impressed as well. But I think it was a fantastic result for the experienced veteran German driver. Somebody who's 37-year-old, still has the passion, still puts on that racing gear and then goes out there to give his level best for Sauber. It was fantastic. In fact, I think it's important to recollect what happened to Nico Hulkenberg upon the conclusion of the 2024 F1 World Championship. He actually scored just 41 points and he stood 11th on the driver standings last year. Today, he scored a fourth of those points at the end of a single race. 10 valuable points for Sauber. And look at the irony, powered by a Ferrari engine and then eventually overtaking, a legendary Ferrari driver at this point in time, probably Lewis Hamilton. Lewis Hamilton would be feeling that he really has a lot of catching up to do, but it's just a bit of an inexplicable situation out there. But Hulkenberg would be very happy, and of course, he would also be glad that he has not been found out yet by Gabriel Bortoleto, who's an exceptionally talented driver. And Hulkenberg is doing just enough to keep his fans and his backers interested in him. On the one hand, it really pains that he's not a driver who's been able to score a podium thus far in Formula One. But if results such as the Spanish Grand Prix ones continue to be by his side, and of course he can put all his experience into play, definitely there would be a day where he could be doing something at least in closer proximity to what the two Williams drivers have been doing, except for today, which wasn't really their day. But yeah, great result for Nico Hulkenberg and an exceptional drive and doing the bulwark of point scoring for Sauber once again.
Yeah, definitely. And we did see a relatively strong performance, I would say, from Gabriel Bortoleto this weekend, but just obviously not enough to be able to, capitalize on the two DNFs ahead of him and, maybe was hoping for a bit more going on ahead, but finished where he started. But Nico Hulkenberg gaining 10 places, from where he started on the grid. Fantastic result today for the German. But Owain, the other driver to really benefit from the safety car in a similarly big way has to be Fernando Alonso, finally getting his first points of 2025 in round nine of the season. He took his Aston Martin up to P9, and now that he's finally broken that duck, do you think he can use that to maybe get some consistency and actually deliver some more results this season.
Yeah, maybe this is all he needs. It was a bit of a scrappy race by Fernando's standards, to be quite honest. Although then again, if you've seen some of his replays, maybe it wasn't. But it was a bit odd to, to see him, end up in a decent points paying position, or at least for his team. What is a decent points paying position? Bearing in mind that the first half of the race, it did seem to be kind of through the wars. I mean, he was, placing the car well and things like that, but going off by himself at turn five, very odd, and something you wouldn't expect from Fernando. I think he's being overtaken or lapped at the time. I think it was overtaken. But he just managed to run out into the gravel, managed to keep it going, luckily, get back to the pits, and then, and as you say, it kind of all came together for him in the back half. I mean, he spent most of the race, or at least portions of the race in 11th. Every time I seemed to look at him, he was in 11th, and after tussling with Hulkenberg at the start. But beyond that point, yeah, he just kind of made that last sort of made a pit stop about 10 laps from the safety car, and I think that helped. It boxed again, but in those last, just off the safety car restart, he was absolutely electric. Really, he just made his way up, and sort of, yeah. He just made his way up, and there was a bit of a sort of tussle at turn one with Behrman and things like that, and he managed to keep the position and profited off that, and then just kind of slowly managed to make it round people. And I think that's maybe the benefit of having someone as experienced as Alonso, is that he knew how to I think save his tires and make sure that he wasn't frustrated by a late safety car and and 6 laps to go by the end of it. He just worked up the few positions that he needed to when other people were fighting, and managed to take advantage of that. And for that, you have to give him credit. But it's what we've seen Fernando Alonso, his entire career. I think this is kind of the point where he's been on a long stretch really of not being in the points when he seems to be usually pretty magnetized to them.
Yeah, I feel like for so much of, I think, maybe 2024 and the latter parts of 2023, like Fernando Alonso would be finishing P7 or P8 almost every single race when he was actually finishing in the points. So to have such a long, period of not being in the points at the start of the season has been quite strange. But as you say, very wily, some very opportunistic overtakes whilst other cars were fighting amongst themselves. And, I think it's just showing his experience for sure. And, those, like, I think over 400 races now? Like, he's done more than double the amount of races that Haas have had, and that's with some seasons not even involved in Formula One. But then he was in Formula One much longer than Haas were. But speaking of Aston Martin, Dev, I would like to touch on the withdrawal of Lance Stroll, which happened, after qualifying, reportedly due to pain in his wrists, which has been linked to his emergency surgery ahead of that 2023 F1 season. This has apparently been going on for several weeks now. Do you think Aston Martin should have maybe acted sooner to protect the health and well-being of their driver?
I think it is already a commonly known fact that Lance Stroll had been experiencing pain in his hand and the wrist region for close to about 6, 7 weeks now, maybe 6.5 weeks. So I ought to have known better. They ought to have reacted better. And at this point in time, they only have themselves to blame, I would say. And I feel for Felipe Dragovic, who would have been just waiting on the sidelines, never to have actually gotten a chance to enter the track or just sit in the car and try maybe his best to create an impression, because of course the future belongs to the youth. And he's a very, very young, capable driver. Of course, to have been signed up as a reserve driver with none other than Aston Martin is a massive gain in his could-be Formula One career. But really, it was kind of a no-brainer. And just imagine with the safety car playing its part, and of course the notoriety of Formula One, which basically means that expect the unexpected. What could have been if there would have been a second Aston Martin car in the field vying for some points, and you're hoping for a strong points finish? We could have possibly had a maiden Grand Prix 2025 for Aston Martin with both the cars in points. But then today was Alonso's day to savor, and deservingly so. But the Lance Stroll predicament, I think Aston Martin are to be blamed for that, and it really could have been handled much better.
Yeah, I mean, you could even stretch the argument to a lot of Lance Stroll's career with Aston Martin of, potentially being handled better. But arguably, I think they've almost made a rod for their own back of, committing to keeping him in the car to the extent that, he's had a qualifying session where it's left him in, potentially in almost too much pain. And then the medical guys have gone, no, that's not happening. And, if he maybe had taken a break earlier in the season, could have been coming into this weekend with a much, stronger performance of Lance Stroll, I think maybe. But yeah, you know, I think there's a lot that needs to be said for teams having, their drivers' best health and interests, at heart. We've finished the season on so many occasions hearing reports of drivers who've had back issues for like the latter half of the season, drivers, suffering because of the teams and stuff. And I think, you know, these are athletes, sure, at the pinnacle of their game, but you've got to look after them, like their livelihood depends on this. But a team, Owain, as we come to sort of like the roundup of what's gone on, a team that had such a strong start to 2025, Williams have been troubled once again by the Circuit de Catalunya, not having the best record here already, but Alex Albon retiring after two broken front wings and a 10-second penalty. Both cars struggling in qualifying, and Carlos Sainz only finishing P14 at his home race. Is this just a bogey track or something truly holding them back this weekend?
I think that you have to look at sort of the comments that James Vowles has made about the way that Williams has been designed in general, and I think a lot of these issues stem from quite a long way back. This isn't something that's come about from even in the last 5 years, let alone anything before that. Sorry, let alone anything more recent. It's just to do with the fact that the Williams seems to have been. I don't know whether that's sort of the engineering tools they have available or had available at Grove, prior to them being acquired by Doralton Capital, and the revolutionary changes that have been made since appointing James Vowles. But the car does seem to be suited to sort of high aerodynamic efficiency at lower downforce circuits. So that's why it's suited to it's suited to places like Baku or Monza and things like that, places where you can generate sort of a high percentage of downforce at these lower wing angles. And by comparison, as in the way that it works with the McLaren, in that the circuit is medium to high speed corners, with a fairly long straight down it. I don't think it doesn't work necessarily so much for Williams, in that they have that big long straight, but obviously there's 15 corners in between. Sorry, 14 corners in between. And as a result of that, they are forced to make sort of compromises in the setup. It's sort of part of the DNA of the car. It's just how it's been designed. But hopefully that will change in various ways going forward. But they're not looking to, they're of the opinion, it seems, that well, these tracks aren't going to suit us, and we shouldn't necessarily try really to, we're just going to accept that they're hard and difficult for us and hope that we can profit off them. But apart from that, even with Albon qualifying in 11th, he got shuffled backwards quite comprehensively at the start, and then was seemingly in the wars from every point after that, to the point where he had to retire. And as you say, it wasn't much better for Sainz. He sort of slowly made his way upwards, but mostly through pit stops from other people rather than any overtakes he could make, unfortunately. I think it's one of those difficult weekends that you have to take the rough with the smooth on. That we will go to Monza, and they'll probably perform very, very well by comparison. But I think they've just accepted a little bit that for the resources they have and where they want to be, this is the compromise they're going to have to make. They're going to have to make the compromise that, we're not going to be good at some of these higher downforce, circuits, and that's okay. We'll just, we'll make the difference where we can. And I want to point to the fact that it seems to be working in the constructors table. Red Racing Bulls, still are, I think, just a regular race win behind, and that is a lot of points for where it is possible for them to finish. I mean, Hadjar made a bit of a dent in them, but apart from that, it's it's going to take a lot for any team to catch up to Williams, and Williams can't really go that much further forward. I would hazard a guess that I'm just going to call it now that they're probably going to be in fifth by the end of the season. So a weekend like this is not too bad if you take the sort of higher level view on it and say, well, we're looking for 2026 and we're at the best position we can be in. We've made our difference now. Um, we just have to sort of ride the rest of it out. I ultimately I don't think this is too much of an issue for Williams, and I think that it's a considered risk.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of the Constructors' Championship as well, it's so worth mentioning now that Nico Hulkenberg's position that he got today has taken Sauber up to P8 and Alpine now firmly P10, which for the French Works team is shocking, really. But speaking of Nico Hulkenberg, let's get to our driver of the day because Grid Talk has overwhelmingly voted for Nico Hulkenberg. The three of us on this show have already sung his praises. So what I'll say is, Dev, was Nico Hulkenberg your driver of the day? And does anybody else deserve a consideration for it?
As much as I would have loved to have voted for Nico Hulkenberg, who drove tremendously well today, scoring 10 amazing points in that incredible P5. For me, the driver of the day would be Oscar Piastri, and I'll tell you why. What's interesting is that he now has 7 wins, okay, on the whole in his career. 5 of those wins have come this year. Each of his victories, I appreciate the fact, have come at a completely different venue, different racing venue, starting from Hungary, Azerbaijan, China, Bahrain, then there was Saudi Arabia, Miami, and now today, of course, Spain. A track where McLaren were under pressure for the last 2.5 decades to deliver the cracker of a performance. And today, finally, a 1-2. And of course, what this win does is that after he failed to win the last 2 Grand Prix with Verstappen winning at Imola and, of course, Norris winning a cracker of a race at Monaco, Piastri has once again, reminded everybody not to, and he's very much in sync with the battle for supremacy where the 2025 title is concerned. So for me, he is the driver of the day. And of course, to have held that race position and defended it so valiantly, checkered flag arrived. That was one hell of an effort. I'll give it to him.
Yeah, definitely. And it would have been so easy for that safety car restart to just, make a tiny mistake and just fall back through the field. There's so much pressure for a 6-lap sprint at the end. So yeah, Oscar Piastri, a valid alternative or, even just a valid option for driver of the day. Owain, how about yourself in the same contextual scenario of Nico Hulkenberg and someone else?
I obviously gave it to Nico Hulkenberg, but I want to make an honourable mention at least for Isaac Hadjar. I mean, um, it's not the easiest sort of place to be, but he was of all the Red Bull drivers that weren't Max Verstappen, he was the highest place and only 2 positions. Well, it actually finished in front of him. Sorry, what with the penalty and things like that. But on the road, obviously, only 2 positions behind, and I think he did really well. I don't think he sort of lost his cool, and he's very clearly showing that he's the I don't want to sing his praises too much because I'll whack him in the car, ruin his confidence, and we'll be talking about another Red Bull silly season before you know it. But by comparison, he's finished ahead of a number of season race winners, kept himself out of trouble, which is very important here, and run a good race where like I say, that there were other drivers who didn't necessarily do so well off that restart, and fell backwards through the field, notably, Lewis Hamilton, for example. So for that, I think he deserves at least an honourable mention, if not the full driver of the day. Apart from Piastri, obviously, because he ran a great race up there.
Yeah, for sure, definitely. So, in light of not having any information from the stewards, I believe the FIA website is currently down. There are still ongoing conversations and investigations. So we'll put a big asterisk on everything that we've just said for this podcast. And if something does come along, be sure to check out our Grid Talk socials. But is there anything you'd like to plug at this opportunity, Dev, if people want to find out more from you?
Yeah, I mean, I also happen to write on cricket. You can check out my work on courtatpoint.com. That's tatpoint.com. And a bit of Formula One content that I do for kairosports.com. That's KYRO Sports, one word. Thank you.
Sounds good. Owain, anything you want to plug at this point?
Um, I think more our Grid Talk social channels, but with respect to the predictions, prediction challenge that we've got going on. It was going so well for me, and up until I believe it was 2 laps to go when Fernando Alonso, um, overtook Liam Lawson quite frustratingly. I can't believe I was hoping that Lawson wouldn't overtake because I'd predicted both that Alonso wouldn't score points but cruelly would finish 11th. And for like I say, large chunks of the race, Fernando Alonso was sitting in 11th, but unfortunately that didn't play out. Which I think is going to sort of slightly blight my return up the field. But you can find out all about that and see the championship table after this race once everything's played out with the decision documents and the FIA website deciding to work. On our at Grid Talk UK on all of the social media platforms with the @. That's where you can keep in touch with us. That's where that's where you would have found out before the podcast that we're celebrating Pride Month here at Grid Talk. So yeah, keep up to date with that on there, and give us have a chat. Tell us how stupid we're being for predicting that Albon wouldn't qualify above Sainz, for example.
I mean, if we're going to talk about stupid predictions, my top three was going to be Leclerc, Oscar Piastri, and Lewis Hamilton, and that did not happen. But you can't make big points if you make the same decisions as everybody else. So I will stand by my prediction, as bold as it was. But yes, if you want to hear more from me, I am at Ruby Rose Price on Instagram and Threads, and at Rubes on Blue Sky. But Grid Talk is available on YouTube as well as Amazon Fire, Spotify, Apple Music, Verbal, and Pocket Casts. Just search Formula One Grid Talk for our back catalogue of shows with previews and reactions to the race results. Thank you to Jared Bradley and Holly Eagle for supporting us on Patreon. If you want to support the show further, why not sign up to our Patreon for exclusive content, and also make sure you subscribe so you're first to know when each new episode is being released. We'll be back soon with plenty more F1 content. Thank you very much for listening to the Grid Talk podcast, and goodbye.